Patch 7.1 brings a brand new ultimate to the table, features Rewritten Ultimate or FRU, which I personally has been looking forward to since the day it was announced, because Eden was the first raid tier that I started to get into Final Fantasy XIV's raiding, which I believe a lot of you guys too. With it, some talks regarding how the world first cheated again by using pixel perfect, which I honestly think is debatable, or maybe how broken Pictomancer is in this ultimate, with 73.7% of usage in the top 50 clears and 0% on Blackmage. But I don't want to talk about all of that. Instead, I want to talk about the current tank meta in FRU and how each tank performs and why some are more preferred by the top players than the other. But before we continue, my name is Aylaveen and I make weekly 14 videos. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing because my fish is pregnant and I need money for her C-section surgery. Full disclaimer, as of recording this, my static has yet to clear and is currently at phase 4 crystallized time, so I'm speaking from the perspective of a progging tank. But I did reach P4 with 3 different tanks other than warrior, but my co-tank is warrior, so I'm not entirely speaking without bases. With that out of the way, let's get into the video. If we take a look at the top 50 clear teams, we can see how clearly Paladin and Dark Knight is preferred compared to Warrior and Gunbreaker, which is odd, because for the past 2 ultimates that has not been the case at all. And in this video, we will take a look at all the factors that made this meta by breaking down the fight and how each job performs in FRU that made people choose Paladin and Dark Knight over Gunbreaker and Warrior. The first aspect we're going to talk about is speed kill comps. First and foremost, we need to address that the top 50 teams does not represent how most on-patch raiders progress. These top 50 teams usually went for the highest damage output, which explains the low pick rates on Warrior in almost every ultimate on patch. But it's not that objectively Warrior is the lowest damage dealer. It's just that they assume Dark Knight and Gunbreaker is the hardest hitting by looking at the statistics of the previous Savage, which most of the time does not translate directly to ultimates because they have a lot of downtimes compared to Savage. But this Dark Knight and Gunbreaker duo pick is still valid. Why? Because the last phase usually has a very long uptime period, which Gunbreaker and Dark Knight thrives compared to Warrior and Paladin. And usually, the last phase DPS check is what matters the most. It can make you clear or enrich at 0.1%, which is why the top team still opted for Dark Knight and Gunbreaker. This aspect explains the Dark Knight's stable pick in top 50 teams, but it still doesn't explain why the high pick rates of Paladin and the low pick rates of Gunbreaker. Which is why we go to the second aspect, uptime and downtimes. In Final Fantasy XIV, some jobs thrive and some jobs sucks when it comes to downtime, which is also true for tanks and why we need to talk about uptime and downtime in FRU. Gunbreaker sucks ass when it comes to downtime, and that has been the case for a very long time. Because if you enter a certain phase after downtime without the right amount of cartridge, it might mess up your rotation. This time around, it's actually slightly better because the cartridge usage of Double Down has been decreased to 1, and they have more 2-minute bursts in the form of Lionheart combo. But the first phase really ruins it for Gunbreaker players, and if you have procced the first phase, Fatebreaker, you will know what I'm talking about. Because in this phase, the downtime during Utopia Sky actually messes up your rotation so much that it separates your No Mercy and Bloodfest. If you didn't use it after Utopia Sky, you will lose a significant amount of damage. But if you do use it, your Bloodfest will not be aligned with your No Mercy, and it also means your burst window will not be aligned with the party rate buff. Some top optimized players have done testings and it came out with something cursed like holding your Lionheart combo till your No Mercy is up. But this aspect alone is enough to discourage early weak players from playing Gunbreaker because it happens so early into the fight. If you recall and you have proc Gunbreaker in top before, you will notice the same thing also happens in top phase 5 after a run Dynamis Sigma, where your No Mercy is up and you opted to align it with the rate buff by holding it for 30 seconds. But it happens quite late into the fight and not this early. And by the time the top players went there with Gunbreaker, they might as well finish the fight with it. But that's not the case for this one because it happens so early into the fight, which I think explains the low pick rates of Gunbreaker. But what about the other tanks? Doesn't this misaligned 1 minute also affect them? Not really. because Warrior and Paladin can just misalign away because they don't have any specific 2-minute burst, and Dark Knight can just separate their Delirium with their Living Shadow since it's not a buff, and still have some Shadowbringers left to put under Raid buff. And all of those misaligned stuff will be corrected at the burst window after the Diamond Dust mechanic in Phase 2. But this aspect still doesn't explain why the very high pick rate of Paladin, which has never been the case for the last 3 years. And that's why I want to talk about Phase 4, where there's a double boss happening, the Usurper of the Frost and Oracle of Darkness. All tanks have burst skills that cleaves, which means you deal more damage the more target there is. Unfortunately, this particular phase has 2 bosses that sticks together most of the time, so it's very easy to cleave them. Here I compiled the skills from tanks that cleaves and their damage output on 2 bosses. You can see from this table that Paladin actually thrives by a long shot, dealing 13.9k potency per 2 minutes, with the closest being Gunbreaker at 8.6k potency, and Warrior on the 3rd place with 5.6, and Dark Knight is the lowest at 4.5. Yes, you can argue that I should be counting Faded Circle per minute and Dark Knight's AoE since it's a gain on 2 targets, but both of those aspects didn't change the fact that Paladin outperforms all other tanks by a long shot. This happens because the full Confiteor combo are all cleave damage and they're a 1-minute skill. On top of that, they have a rather low cleave reduction of 50%, whereas other tanks like Warrior got a higher cleave reduction by 70%. The disparity between tanks in this department is why I think Paladin become a must pick for a lot of top groups that wanted to clear P4 so they can progress to P5 as soon as possible, on top of having extra party mitigation with Passage of Arms that is useful in a lot of situations. All in all, despite the current meta, I think all tanks are viable to play in this ultimate. Even with the very low pick rate, Gunbreaker is still the hardest hitting tank in P5 Pandora, and that can be a game changer when you're aiming to clear and avoid enrage. And Warrior is still a very solid pick for progging with their personal sustain to the boss's auto attacks and its low cooldown info, which can save you some mitigations or recover a pull from wiping sometimes. So don't be too focused on the current meta, and play what you're most comfortable with. Especially when progging an ultimate where you really need to be very comfortable with your job so you can perform your best. So that's it for this video. If you're watching this, are you progging FRU in this patch? Have you cleared yet? If you haven't, where is your group currently at? Let me know in the comment section down below and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.